Yeah, good morning. It's now 5:30, daybreak in Germany. I send my greetings from Europe to Africa and especially from Germany to Ghana. We continue with Kwame Nukrumah. Next chapter, Africa in World Affairs. It is impossible to separate the affairs of Africa from the affairs of the world as a whole. Not only has the history of Africa been too closely involved with Europe and the Western Hemisphere, but that very involvement has been the driving force in bringing about major wars and international conflicts for which Africans have not been responsible. Africa has too long been the victim of destructive aggression, which will attempts to make a hunting ground of our continent. Our interest, therefore, in the maintenance of peace and the elimination of the forces which daily threaten it is very real indeed. Hence, our cooperation in any living organism that can be counted on effectively to promote international peace, provided it does not invade our independence of action, is assured. At the moment, there exists only the United Nations organization, which offers, with all its defects, the possibility of working towards a peaceful world. When the United Nations organization was founded in 1945, Asian and African nationalism was of little consequence. Since then, however, so many former colonies have achieved independence that Afro-Asian countries now form the most influential single group within the United Nations. At the end of 1961, African states occupied more than a quarter of the seats. The proportion might rise to almost a third as the entire African continent becomes free. This possibility was certainly in the minds of those at the Lagos Conference when they passed a resolution calling for a specifically African group at the United Nations. But the dramatic increase in the international importance of independent Africa, though it may at first sight appear to demonstrate strength, in fact reflects weakness, since it is based in the fragmentation of the continent into many states, few of which are really viable. The two most powerful countries in the world are the USSR and the USA, with population of 250 million and 185 million respectively. Yeah, but this was like 50, 60 years ago, so it's more now. Both have one representative, each at the United Nations, as entities through the Belarus Soviet Socialist Republic and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, unites of the USSR, are each represented since Laos and Cambodia were admitted. India, I have to read this again. Okay, the two most powerful countries in the world are the USSR, Soviet Union, Russia, and the USA, with population of 215 million and 185 million respectively. Both have an representative each at the United Nations as entities through the Belorussian Socialist Republic and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Units of the USSR are each represented since Laos and Cambodia were admitted. India, with a population of 460 million, also has only one representative. When the People's Republic of China is admitted, its mighty population of over 640 million people will doubtless have a single representative. There is no reason, therefore, why Africa, with its approximately 300 million people, once united, should not send a single representative to the United Nations. A single representation resting on the strength of a whole continent would be more positive in its influence than all the separate representations of the African states put together. That's why Africa is so quiet today in the case of the Putin war. Because too many contracts has already been signed with. Okay, we continue. Although confidence in the United Nations has suffered several shocks since its foundation, and particularly of late in connection with the Congo crisis, it remains the only world organization in which the many problems of the world have a chance of finding reasonable solutions. It must therefore be supported by all interested in the preservation of peace and the progress of human civilization. We in Ghana showed our faith in the organization when we responded at once with troops to support United Nations intervention in the Congo in 1960. The reason why we did not withdraw our troops when several other countries did was because we felt that by doing so we would weaken the authority of the United Nations and leave the way open for the intensification of intervention from just those forces we are anxious to oust. O-U-S-T, I don't know the word, to oust. Anxious to oust. Let me drink a drop of coffee, please. Recently, in January 1962, Ghana was elected to serve for 2 years as a non-permanent member of the 11-Nation Security Council. We welcomed the opportunity to take our share of responsibility in the United Nations. This does not deter us from pressing for certain chances in the administrative structure which we consider necessary if it is to function as a more objectively serviceable organ of world peace. The United Nations, in its present form, does not reflect true conditions in the world at this time. Today, more and more countries are assuming the dignity of sovereign states out of a colonial state which previously made them nothing but appendages or vassals of imperialism. It has not, however, eliminated the view that the powerful nations and some who regard themselves as still powerful even through events have provided their brittle vulnerability, have a right to set the pattern for the budding nations and even to interfere nakedly in the international affairs of these struggling states. Whew. This Kwame makes me dizzy in my head, really. It's hard to read, but very educated. So much. In the past, might meant right. The idea that right presides in might still persists. Indeed, it has achieved its fateful acme in the contest between the two colossi who seek to draw the rest of the world into their opposing camps. However, the very fact of a progressively enlarging world which is altering not only in the number of independent nations but in kind is having its impact in creating a fringe block of states which, through tough, individually unimportant collectively, are able to exert an influence on the international scene which is unprecedented. Their common concern with the anti-colonial struggle and the continuing liberation of subjected terrorists, enforcing the United Nations to abandon these temporizing methods for more positive measures in connection with arbitrary rule in Africa, as well as the extension of aid to the less developed parts of the world. The constant whittling at South Africa's resistance resulted in the visit in May 1962 of a United Nations special mission to the Trust Territory of South-West Africa to investigate allegations of slavery and maltreatment. Another delegation from the United Nations Special Committee on Colonization visited East Africa to inquire into conditions in Mozambique from freedom fighters who had been forced into exile in Tanganyika and elsewhere. A 17-nation subcommittee which sent a mission to Central Africa to examine the tenability of Central African Federation recommended its breaking up as it is imposed no freedom measures on the majority population. Oh God. It found that the proposed new constitution for Northern Rhodesia was basically undemocratic and discriminatory. The principle of parity made a shame of democracy by providing 70,000 non-Africans with 15 seats in parliament and giving the same number to 3 million Africans. Nothing like this busy concern with the African search for freedom could ever have happened without the concerted pressure of the newly independent states within the World Organization of Nations. And they are able to operate their deceive influence because many of them adhere to a policy of non-commitment to either of the East-West blocks, a policy of neutral non-alignment, but not of passivity. They exercise their right of free choice in supporting those acts which they consider will help to maintain the peace on which their continuance as independent nations rests. When the United Nations came into being, the old order still existed and its rules made concessions to the prevailing assumption of the priority of the great powers. It is now necessary that recognizing be given and concession made to be novel factor of a growing number of new states unwilling to be swallowed up by the older powerful ones. Thus, those at the Conference of Non-Aligned Countries held in the Belgrade in September 1961, Kwame suggested that 3 deputy secretary generals should be appointed, one from the east, one from the west, and the third from among the uncommitted nations. This would reflect the mainstream of current political thought, restore confidence in the Secretary Generalship, and enlarge the objectivity of the Secretariat. I also proposed the setting up of an executive body elected by the General Assembly, whose duty it would be to ensure that the decisions of both the General Assembly and the Security Council were faithful and promptly put into effect. For it cannot be denied that decisions are not always readily executed. An effective secretary, I am a secretary by certificate, effective secretariat is essential to the proper functioning of the United Nations and the energetic implementation of decisions. Yeah, then I vote for a job now at the United Nations as a secretary. That would be cool. Africa needs anyway a new system. And Kwame told us the key, but we are ignorant and we have forgotten. Let's continue. United Nations and the energetic implementation of decisions. Point. Ever darkening clouds over Angola, Southwest Africa, the Rhodesias, Congo, Laos, Korea, and over Berlin, gravely overcast the international sky. It is significant that so many uneasy centers are in Africa and Asia, for where they are not the direct outcome of Western imperialist maneuvering, they are engaged with an issue arising from the conflict between the two great power blocks of East and West, with which the peace of the world is dangerously tied up. These two blocks are each committed to its own political and economic ideology. Both are military powerful, and each is suspicious of the thoughts and actions of the other. The failure to reach any agreement over such fundamental issues is disarmament, and the testing of nuclear weapons seems to hold out little hope for the future. A new and vigorous approach to the problem of peace and war is needed. Yes, the time has come when the destiny of mankind should cease to hang so dangerously on its aims and ambitions of the great powers. In recent years, I have traveled extensively in America, in the Soviet Union, in Europe, India, and China, where I have spoken to men and women in all walks of life. Everywhere I have noticed a deep longing for peace. This universal, but often inarticulate desire for peace must find expression and exert its proper influence on the conduct of world affairs. For peace is indivisible. Disagreement between East and West, for example over Laos or Berlin, can threaten the security of the whole of the rest of the world. Yeah, so does Putin can do. These were the kind of considerations behind the Belgrade Conference of the non-aligned countries, held in September 1961, which 25 countries, Afghanistan, Algeria, Burma, Cambodia, Ceylon, Congo, Cuba, Cyprus, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guinea, India, Indonesia, Iraq, Lebanon, Mali, Morocco, Nepal, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Sudan, Tunisia, United Arab Republic, Yemen, and Yugoslavia. There were observers from Brazil, Bolivia, and Ecuador. Held in September 1961, which 25 countries attended. At Belgrade, we did not intend to form a third power bloc, but we did hope by our solidarity to constitute ourselves into a distinct moral force which might hold the balance of power between East and West in the cause of peace. At the time, the United States was spending an estimated $74.966 million, almost $50 million, 60 years ago, $60 million a year on defense and armaments alone, more than half the entire national budget. In 1960, the Soviet Union spent some 96 million rubles on defense out of a national budget of 74.5 million rubles. In a declaration issued at the end of the Belgrade Conference, the United Nations was asked to convenes either a special session of the General Assembly to discuss disarmament or to call a World Disarmament Conference. When the non, give me a second, it's going to take too long. I make a part 2. Here we stop. We stop here and we'll make part 2. Special session of the General Assembly to discuss disarmament or to call a World Disarmament Conference. Okay, we continue soon. Have a nice day all over the world. One world, one love, and peace all over.